It's such a privilege here at Waypoint Church Partners to serve you all with yet another exceptional resource. We get so much positive feedback on our webinars. We're just grateful we're able to keep providing these at no cost and pray they are really helpful to you, your church, your leadership. You can click on the bell icon to subscribe to the Waypoint YouTube channel, which will alert you to future valuable resources. And then feel free to scroll through the many past webinars that are available if those can serve you in some way. I'm super excited about our guest presenter today. Dr. Mark Kortepeter is a really good kind of friend to have, the kind that not only knows a lot, but is able to synthesize it in such a way that I can actually understand it and use it. I hope that will be the case for you today as well. Mark and I go back about 20 years, as he and his lovely and talented family are longtime members of the Church of Christ at Manor Woods, where I served as the senior minister up until joining the Waypoint staff earlier this year. Mark is not only knowledgeable in the biomedical field, he brings vast experience, history, and frontline experience. If along the way here you have any questions, go ahead and add them to the Q&A. We won't be able to get to those today, but we'll work to creatively answer those following the conclusion of the webinar. When there seems to be so much confusion on this front, he's a good friend to know. I hope you'll find his insights as helpful as I have as we navigate church together. Mark, welcome. Thanks for joining us today.
Great. Thanks, Dyke, and thank you all for the opportunity to be here today. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you today. I'm going to give you a talk here entitled Tales from Inside the Hot Zone of Relevance to COVID-19. So just a little bit about my background. I'm currently a professor of epidemiology at the University of Nebraska Medical Center, and I run what's called the Special Pathogens Research Network, which has 10 centers across the country doing research currently actually on COVID-19. So this is what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to be give you a little bit of a career snapshot, and then I'm going to give you some lessons from crises that are in my book called Inside the Hot Zone. First about a response to a national crisis, then a response to lab crisis, and synthesize those in a little bit about some lessons from COVID-19, and hopefully a little teaching along the way for everybody. So let's just start here. Well, my career started really in college when I was thinking about going to medical school, and my background is infectious disease. I'm an infectious disease and preventive medicine physician. And I used to sit in my dorm room watching episodes of MASH, and some of you will recognize Hawkeye Pierce or Alan Alda in the TV show MASH. We all wanted to be doctors like Hawkeye Pierce, although I never really thought about joining the military. But I ended up later joining the Army as a way to pay for medical school. And so I thought, they had a program called the Health Professions Scholarship Program, where you would, they would pay for medical school, and then you would owe them about 4 years for your training. But I ended up staying in for a career of 27 plus years, retiring about 4 years ago. I never imagined I'd stay so long, but I was just having so much fun. And part of that is I chose to do infectious diseases. And for me, my first training was in Hawaii at the Triple Army Medical Center, where I did my internal medicine training. And we did a lot of tropical medicine there. And tropical medicine seemed to me to be nice, something exotic. It gave me the opportunity to travel to some strange locations around the world. I also like the idea of treating and curing patients. My career took a very interesting turn, though, when I was assigned to the U.S. Army Medical Research Institute for Infectious Diseases, or also known as USAMRIID. We affectionately call it the Hot Zone at Fort Detrick. And USAMRIID is the Army's lead biodefense institute, and they have specialized containment laboratories, biosafety level 3 and 4, for managing some of the world's most dangerous pathogens, things like anthrax, Ebola. This is where I really got interested in some aspects of biodefense, because this was really the hub to be at. And I think it's instructive to just give you a little background on biological or germ warfare or terrorism. So at their most basic, it's using infectious pathogens or toxins to make people sick in a war or for terrorism. There are various agents that are considered as so-called good biological agents, and the various superpowers determine these over years of study. And these are the sort of like the top 6 bad actors: anthrax, smallpox, plague, tularemia, botulism, and viral hemorrhagic fevers like Ebola or Marburg. The CDC dubs these the category A threat agents. In my book, I call them the chessmen of doom. And I do that for a couple of reasons. The main reason is to just give readers the something to take away in terms of something easy to recognize and to visualize. So I name each of these different pathogens after one of the chess pieces based on their characteristics. So for example, the queen is anthrax. So anthrax is the queen because it's the most powerful piece on the chessboard. It also can travel any direction across the entire board to wipe out its opponent. And so anthrax is highly deadly. It can spread very long distances downwind. We're talking tens of kilometers. In some ways, it's very close to the ideal biological weapon. That's just one example. So why do we worry about biological warfare or biological weapons? Because we know various countries around the world either have programs, had programs, or we're concerned that they do have programs. So we know very much for certain that Iraq and the former Soviet Union had biological weapons programs before the breakup. We suspect Russia has a program still, most likely within, and then there are various other countries we're pretty sure have them, places like China, Iran, and North Korea. This is a good example of what one of these looks like. So this is one of the former Soviet production facilities. And making biological weapons is very much, it requires the same technology as making something like beer or wine. It just uses fermentation technology. And these are 10,000 liter fermenters for making anthrax. And there are 40 of these fermenters. So you can just imagine the large scale industrial production that was developed in this program. Well, you may or may not know, though, that the US also had its own biological weapon program. And these are some of the things that were being developed. Bacillus anthracis, which causes anthrax, the botulinum toxins, which cause botulism, Francisella tularensis, which causes tularemia, and various other incapacitating agents. In addition, we were also interested in anti-crop agents: wheat stem rust, rice blast, rice blast, and rice stem rust. And why? Well, you can imagine the economic damage that could be caused if you were to wipe out your opponent's wheat fields in terms of their ability to feed their army. So these can have major effects on economics as well as anti-personnel effects. So let's start with the first crisis, which is response to a national crisis. Well, most of you will probably remember September 11, 2001. Well, put yourself in this scenario just about 3 weeks later. It turns out I was the chief of medicine at USAMRIID at the time. I came back to my office one afternoon. On my desk was a note from my boss, said, Mark, Tom Brokaw called. He wants you to call him back. Now, interestingly, a couple days before this, I'd had a call while I was in church about a suspicious letter. And that was the first salvo, and this is really the second salvo. Well, I wasn't sure what was going on here. I wasn't even sure whether this was a real event or a joke, because it wasn't every day that I had Tom Brokaw calling me, who is a very powerful man at NBC News. But, I thought about, could this be a joke? Is it time to head to the gym? Do I dump this on my deputy? Or perhaps maybe I should get some colleagues on the call with me. So we ended up calling him back. Turns out one of his assistants opened a letter with a white powder a week earlier. It was tested negative by local law enforcement for some of the common biothreat agents. But now this individual has a poorly healing lesion on her shoulder. She's seen multiple physicians without a diagnosis. This is what this thing looked like. And you can see it's a very nice sort of large black scab. And you can see a couple telltale signs there of biopsy sites there with the suture lines on the outside of the lesion. Well, she eventually saw a tropical medicine specialist who said it looked like anthrax. Is this an outbreak? Is it bioterrorism? Is this something we need to worry about? Now, interestingly, at the time, we didn't have the luxury of being able to text photos around the way we can do immediately. And so I actually didn't see that photo till about a week after we got this call. One of the things we're taught in medical school is when you hear hoofbeats of something coming towards you in terms of some disease galloping towards you, you're supposed to think of things that are common, like horses, rather than something unusual, like zebras. Well, what we said to Mr. Brokaw was, well, we don't know. This could be anthrax. Here again, we didn't have a picture of it at the time. It could be a spider bite, could be some type of allergic reaction. This individual actually had some skin problems as baseline. But go ahead and send us a biopsy on wet ice and we'll see what we can find. Let's start with a little more background on anthrax. So anthrax occurs worldwide, and you can see the areas where it's more prevalent or causes more disease, places like sub-Saharan Africa in red and pink, or parts of Asia. The United States actually still has cases that are sporadic, and usually the people who get infected are those who have close contact with large herbivores, sheep, cattle, goats, because those herbivores get infected while they're grazing, because the spores for anthrax actually live in the soil. And so as they ingest these spores, they end up getting what's called gastrointestinal anthrax, and then they'll die. And then before they die, they'll defecate a large amount of blood in their stool, and as well as, which includes anthrax spores. And so that'll contaminate the ground for another cycle of infection later. So we used to have the large cattle trains where infections would occur, and we still do sporadically have those cases. Well, these are the characteristic features of anthrax on the skin. So one is having this black scab or a black eschar. And you can see on this child, just below the right eye there, is this black scab. And the name for anthrax actually comes from this black scab. It's the Greek word anthracus for coal. And then you also see, as another property, swelling out of proportion to the size of the lesion. So you can see this child's entire face is swollen, despite this lesion not being that large. Well, this is a shepherd I saw in the Republic of Georgia several years back. And the shepherd had slaughtered a sheep about a week earlier, came in pretty sick, actually, and then had these large lesions on his hands from contamination from the sheep. He'd actually been treated for a couple of days with antibiotics before I saw him, so a lot of the swelling had been reduced by then. But what we worry about is really inhalational anthrax, not anthrax on the skin. So what happens is people will inhale spores. So you can see on the left side here, these spores are being inhaled, and they travel down the windpipe into the lungs. And anthrax is really a disease of lymphatics. It's not so much a disease of the lungs, but it just happens to be the entry point through the lungs for inhalational anthrax. And if you look at the picture on the right, what happens with anthrax is there's a massive engorgement of the lymph nodes. They become bloody and filled with lymphatic fluid. And the lungs also fill up, the chest cavity fills up here with this fluid on the right side. And so what you normally see in a chest x-ray is a lot of black, because it's the x-ray beams going through the body very easily onto the x-ray film. But here you can see the central part of the chest is filling up with this white, as well as the base of the chest x-ray. So we call this a wide mediastinum. The mediastinum is the space in the center chest. This is a hallmark for inhalational anthrax. Well, interestingly, shortly before 9/11, there's a study done by the Canadian laboratory, which was sort of the sister laboratory to USAMRIID. And they wanted to know how fast spores would spread and how far within a room if somebody opened a letter with spores in it. And so they had a simulant spore put in a letter. Somebody opened it here at ground zero, and they were shocked to find within 48 seconds, it was across the hallway, identified in 96 seconds down the hallway into some of the other lab rooms. This is quite surprising. But as I said, my chapter 5 of the book, no one could have predicted we were about to experience a real life validation of the Canadian experiment at the seat of our government. That's what happened. This letter arrived at the Hart Senate Office building in October 2001, saying, "You cannot stop us. We have this anthrax. You die now." Well, this is a diagram of the 6th floor of the Hart Senate building. If you look here on the upper left, this dark yellow room is the Daschle office, Senator Tom Daschle. And the star is where the person opened the letter. And as the contents of the letter spilled out, everybody in that room was exposed to anthrax, that we were able to detect it in their nose when they swabbed for anthrax spores. And even people in the neighboring office of Senator Feingold, as well as somebody out in the hallway. We received this letter at USAMRIID, and as you can see, here's Johnny Zell, my colleague who ran the Special Pathogens Laboratory, displaying the letter inside the Biosafety Level 3 laboratory. Well, John was a very seasoned microbiologist who'd been in the business for 40 years or so, and he was the one who opened this letter under the microbiology hood inside the laboratory. And as he slid this letter out of the envelope, he was surprised to see this wafting of like this smoke cloud of spores that wafted up off the page right in front of his face behind the pane of glass he was looking through. It really freaked him out. So he snorted bleach up his nose and crashed out of the lab and rushed down to our clinic, where he's told me, I saw the face of the devil in the smoke cloud. Well, a stampede of our zebras had arrived at our doorstep, something highly unusual. And we now know that there are multiple letters put in through the mail shortly after 9/11. You can see the Brokaw letter on the upper left, the Daschle letter, another letter to Senator Leahy, which also later came to us for analysis. So USAMRIID went into 24/7 operations. We were the national hub for diagnostics and the FBI's referral center. As the chief of medicine, my role was to lead the management of the laboratory workers who were exposed. I also led the response a couple of months later when we found contamination outside the containment laboratory, which is really not something you want to find. But we were concerned that might have happened when these letters were brought in. If I think back here, I wasn't immune to being scared at the time, even though I'm an infectious disease and public health doctor, and I was worried about it potentially having been exposed as well. And I would open my letters in the garage every night with an N95 mask. There are a couple lessons learned, I think, from this. First of all, we have to keep an open mind for the unexpected. And we're not very good, though, at recognizing new things until they kind of hit us on the head. I think the good news is that the medical system is responsive and we can adapt once we know what's happening. And I think some of the anthrax victims were saved once word got out that anthrax was circulating in the mail. All right, let's move on to another crisis. This is a response to a laboratory crisis. I was still the chief of medicine at the time in 2004 at USAMRIID. And one afternoon, while walking up the hallway toward the nurse's station, one of our virologists rushed around the corner and blurted out, "We have Ebola exposure in the lab." Well, what might you call this? I call it a very bad day. Some more history here. So the patient is a 30-year-old female postdoctoral candidate, and she's working with 10 mice that she'd infected with Ebola Zaire 2 days earlier, and she was giving intraperitoneal injections of an antibody preparation. Now, Ebola Zaire happens to be the most deadly of the different species of Ebola, and she was using the same needle, essentially lining up 10 mice, and she was about to inject the fifth mouse. And at the time, the mouse kicked, which knocked her hand off its trajectory, and the needle penetrated through 2 layers of protective gloves and cut the base of her thumb. So she's showering out of the lab on her way to the clinic. Now, a couple things about Ebola. In the natural setting, it kills about 60 to 90% of the victims in Africa. And then what we knew of at the time was the data on anybody who got a needle stick was it was 100% fatal. So we were obviously concerned, and we assumed this woman was probably going to die. Well, this is the enemy. This is Ebola virus. It's called a filovirus, named after the Latin term phylum, which means thread. You can see it's kind of got a little filamentous look to it. So someone who gets Ebola starts out initially with a fairly abrupt onset of fever, and then within about 2 to 3 days, they go through what's called the wet phase, where they start having a large amount of vomiting and diarrhea, which then drops their, essentially they lose a lot of fluid. Early in the first week, they can have a sore throat, or they can have a rash, sort of a red spotty rash. It's kind of hard to see on darker skinned individuals, as you see on the upper right. And then they also could get what we call injection of the conjunctiva. Just looks sort of like somebody has a conjunctivitis. But then as they get near the end of that first week, and into the second week, they start going through a sort of a death spiral. They can start having bleeding, and you can see usually it's kind of like oozing from intravenous sites in the lower left there, or some bleeding around the gum lines, as you can see on the right side. And they can also have large amount of bleeding if they have bleeding from their gastrointestinal system. So as you can see on the upper left, this individual's vomiting blood into a bucket. But despite what you see in the movies, you don't have people just bleeding all over the place, bleeding from their eyeballs, et cetera. And the bleeding really isn't what kills people. It's really the fact that they start dropping their blood pressure to the point they go into shock, very much like someone who's going into septic shock. And that's really what kills them. But one of the problems with Ebola is that it spreads directly to those who are caring for victims through infected blood or body fluids. So you have to have fairly close contact, but unfortunately, when someone's vomiting a lot or having a lot of diarrhea, or they might be bleeding, if you don't have the appropriate personal protective equipment and know what you're doing, it's very easy to become infected. So the people who get infected are, people in hospitals, people taking care of victims at home. And then in parts of Africa where this occurs, there are cultural practices where there's a lot of contact with the dead body during funeral rites. And so if you have somebody who's pretty high up in the food chain in the village, like the chief or the village priest, where the entire village goes out to the funeral and has contact with the dead body, it's a very dangerous situation. And this is where we have this large amount of spread that happens very suddenly. And unfortunately, often what happens in the home or the hospital is cases will come in, they're not recognized, and then a week or two later, suddenly there's an explosion of cases in the hospital, and the hospital actually has to close because it affects all the caregivers. As a result of this, we had a specialized facility at USAMRIID called the Slammer, so nicknamed because being put in there is like being put in prison. And it's at its most basic, it's an intensive care unit that had all the trappings of the biosafety level for maximum containment laboratory. So you can see here through the window, it's got a decontamination shower on the left. You can see on the outside of the door, there's a magnehelic gauge because it is able to turn on negative pressure. And there are ways to get things inside, in and out of into the slammer through things like a pass box. Here you can see below, it's an ultraviolet light pass box with a double autoclave as well. So the caregivers could work in this environment, taking care of the patient. They would wear a spacesuit. Now, this is me when I was working on Ebola virus in the containment laboratory, but you would do the same thing inside the slammer if you're a caregiver. So essentially, I'm wearing this fully encapsulated spacesuit, and the air is coming through this what looks like essentially it's like a tire pump. It's pressurized air coming in from the ceiling, and then it goes through a HEPA filter here, such that I will allow this to fill up the suit completely. So you walk around kind of like the Michelin man, and then you unhook, and then you can walk around the laboratory freely for a couple minutes before you have to hook up again. It's very loud, so you have to wear earplugs here because the air is rushing over your head while you're there. So what was my role in this situation? Well, I was chief of medicine and therefore the senior medical advisor to the USAMRIID commander, who's the director of the institute, and overall coordinator of the response. And we ended up ripping everyone out of their day job, setting up a crisis response team. And I had to coordinate investigational products with the FDA. So the situation was much different than it is now. We had no products that we knew or we thought even worked. There were 2 monkey studies recently that had been conducted that showed some promise. So we were ready to give those products if we needed to. The other thing is I had to interface with the media as well as the Pentagon and state health authorities. As you can imagine, the Pentagon likes to find blame when something like this happens. So we had to sort of go and tap dance a little bit down there at the Pentagon. But in the end, we had 21 days of nail biting for the victim inside as well as for ourselves on the outside. The good news, in the end, she did well, and here she is on her last day in the slammer. She's smiling because she's about to be released. And this is her nurse who's showing this mock newsletter that they wrote up, says, prisoner released from the slammer today. So it was a great day of celebration for all of us. So what are some lessons learned? Well, I think number one, when you have a crisis, it's important to have leadership, to build a team, and you have to be ready to adapt very quickly as things are changing constantly. The other thing, it's very important to have good communication. You have to really keep everybody in the loop, both internally for us in the Institute, we had to keep everybody in the loop, as well as the health department, the media, and also keeping the family aware of what we're doing and why we're doing it. All right, I'm going to just give you a teaser here before I move on to sort of the next crisis. So this is just a brief teaser of another crisis on October, and also in October 2001, it was around 2 a.m. I got a phone call from my boss. He said, I need you to pack and ship 150 doses of botulinum antitoxin to send to Japan emergently. Well, after I sort of dusted off the cobwebs from my brain, it was 2 a.m. and sort of woke up suddenly for that, I knew this was a big disaster because botulinum toxin is the most deadly substance on the planet. I call it the pawn in my book, but what it does is it causes paralysis and suffocation. You can see this baby that's been intoxicated. The body is completely limp. And what you may not be able to see here is child also has here a tracheostomy because he's on a ventilator. So essentially, someone who gets botulism, if they're not treated appropriately with antitoxin quickly, they can end up sort of like being buried alive. They end up suffocating. So we spent the whole night, I called in a couple of colleagues, spent the whole night packing up 150 vials to ship across the world. This is not so simple because we had to keep them essentially at freezing temperatures, essentially without a freezer. And we also, because this was an investigational antitoxin, it had to go with about 2,000 pages of paper for all the potential victims to do and sign informed consent forms, which were at least 30 pages long. So about 7 in the morning, I ferried the products with a police escort down to Andrews Air Force Base. And early in the wee hours, we learned who the presumed victims were. Drum roll, President Bush and his cabinet members. So that's just a teaser of another chapter in the book. All right, so what are some of the specialized skills I've learned over the course of my career? Things like infectious disease and public health. I've learned how to work in a containment environment, both a laboratory as well as a patient care environment. I've had military roles and leadership. I've had field experience, biodefense, as well as research experience. So what does somebody do with all these skill sets? Well, when I was in the military, they like to send you off to war. So here I am with colleagues on a special investigational response team that was sent to Iraq for the 2003 Iraqi freedom. And here we are about to get on a Black Hawk to fly out to the Comfort Navy hospital ship to teach them about the various products we brought into theater in case we were slimed by something from Iraq and Saddam Hussein. And here I am giving a brief to some of the combat support hospital physicians. And this is the day before the shock and awe campaign where the US started bombing raids over Baghdad at the beginning of the war. And so, of course, we are at the northernmost base, 10 miles from the Iraqi border, and we started getting shelled with Scud missile attacks. And in the middle of this briefing to the doctors at the Combat Support Hospital, we had the sirens go off and we were getting a Scud missile alert. And so everybody donned their protective equipment. I ended up continuing on with the brief, which was probably foolish, but we should have probably jumped into a bunker. Fortunately, we had Patriot missiles on our side, which knocked down the Scud missiles. So in the end, it was good news, I guess. Well, I've also been able, since I got out of the military, to help out in other field environments. So I was sent by the World Health Organization as a result of the Ebola outbreak that started in 2018 in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So I was sent to the country of Burundi on the eastern border of the DRC to help them as the lead for infection prevention control, to help them prepare for Ebola if it ever spilled over across the border. And so here's my office there. It's a fairly austere setting, but having been in the military, I'm fairly used to being in places where there's not a lot of capabilities. And then I traveled around the country assessing their various hospitals to see if they were prepared, and wrote up a report for the Ministry of Health, in addition to helping them prepare their Ebola treatment center in case they needed it to care for victims. All right, so let's talk about the last crisis here, which is, I say, is response to the next crisis, a little bit tongue in cheek here. So Louis Pasteur says, in the fields of observation, chance favors only the prepared mind. As I say in my book in chapter 23, it's only a matter of time until the next mysterious illness emerges. We know only one thing for certain: something else will come along when we least expect it, and it will be something we don't anticipate. Well, why do we worry? Well, we've seen Mother Nature as a very efficient, if not the most efficient bioterrorist. She's brought us new things like SARS, MERS, Zika virus, chikungunya, and of course, Ebola. And I like to ask in my classes I teach at the university, what's next? Well, I would say right now, we know what's next. It's what we're dealing with currently. It's COVID-19. Now, there's been a lot of armchair quarterbacking about, hey, we should have, if we'd known more about this early on, we could have done a lot more and stopped this from happening, And I think those are, unfortunately, I think despite all our saying that, I don't think it's really valid, because I think early on we had a pretty good warning how dangerous this virus could be. If you think about the Diamond Princess cruise ship off the coast of Yokohama, Japan in February, when it was quarantined, when they're having case after case of illness there, I was asked to speak up in an interview with Reuters on February 11th. I said, the ship infections point to an agent that is highly transmissible, at least in enclosed environments. The virus is unforgiving, and there's no room for error in the use of personal protective equipment and hand hygiene. A small number of virus particles is likely needed to infect, making it an efficient spreader. So this is, think back, this is February 11th, 2020. And I'm glad to say, when I look back on things like this, I was right even back then when we really didn't know very much about this. And if you look at this curve across the world showing all the cases, reported cases across the world, this arrow shown on the left here shows you exactly where that was February 11th. In fact, this is when China's cases peaked, but you can see the rest of the world really hadn't really started up cases. And it was about a month later where suddenly we had an explosion of cases across the world here, exponential ride. We had a bit of a plateau, and then it's just continued to march on from there. And you can see this is broken down by region of the world. The Pan American Health Organization region, which is in sort of this orange color at the top, has really driven the outbreak. And it followed now by Southeast Asia, which includes places like India. So we've had massive spread. So unfortunately, as of just 2 days ago, the latest numbers are over 21 million cases, with over 760,000 deaths as a result of this. And if you look at the United States, we're over 5 million cases. So sadly, even though we're about only 4% to 5% of the world's population, we're about a quarter of the cases. And similarly, 167,000 deaths, which is over 21% of deaths. So we're disproportionately represented both in cases and deaths. And for me, as a public health practitioner and infectious disease doc, this is really, in some ways, it's embarrassing. It's actually very, very saddening to watch. And if you look at where we compare to another union across the pond, you can see what's happened in Europe compared to what's happened in the United States. So Europe here is in blue, United States in red. You can see where we actually made some progress up until about mid-June. Then suddenly we said, well, this is nothing to worry about. And you can see we just launched from there in the wrong direction. But what's the fundamental problem about this virus? Well, a couple things. I think it spreads similar to influenza, and there's no underlying population immunity at the start. So it's almost like you have someone driving down the highway, or the virus is driving down the highway, and there's no toll booths to slow it down along the way. So you mix that with the fact that it's more severe in certain populations, and in some ways we don't really know how it is with anybody, because we can't quite tease out why someone who's 25 gets it and has a very severe illness, and someone who's 70 gets it and doesn't have any illness. We haven't figured that out yet. And the fact is, we have no magic bullet. We do have some things that maybe look like they help a little bit, but fundamentally no magic bullet. So we combine the transmissibility with severity is what's really giving us the impact here. Now, fortunately, I've been part of this response, and as I said, I run this research network across the country. You can see our research partners on the right side, and we've been part of various large-scale trials working with the NIH. And recently we were part of this publication called Remdesivir for Treatment of COVID-19. And we've been doing some other studies with remdesivir, which is an antiviral drug. And then we're looking at some other things down the line here. So it's been great to at least be part of the response. In addition, I was sent a couple months ago by the Pan American Health Organization, which is a part of the World Health Organization for this part of the world. I was sent to a couple Caribbean countries to assist in their preparedness efforts. And this is the island of Dominica. And it's actually a very beautiful island. I didn't sadly get to do much at the beach here that you see. Instead, I was in hospitals and clinics walking around trying to help them prepare. The good news is actually they've done very well. They've only had 18 cases. So it helps to be in an island nation where you can sort of close the borders. And here I am in the island of Dominica with the Minister of Health as we're talking about their preparedness efforts in their new quarantine facility they were setting up at the time. So I think there's some lessons learned, though, with this outbreak, which hopefully we'll take with us for the future. I think we failed to heed some of the early warnings despite all our preparations. And I think back to November of just 2019, I was at a response seminar, essentially a scenario where we were looking at a coronavirus outbreak, pandemic across the world and what we were going to do about it. So sadly, I think a lot of our preparations haven't worked. And so I think the other thing is communication and unity of effort is critical to our response. I think there's been some challenges there. I think we're slowly learning about the enemy, but I don't think we've applied the knowledge sufficiently to our response. And I think the politicization of the outbreak response has been detrimental overall to the response. And this goes on all sides of the aisle here. You could say I had some little premonition of this when I responded to another Reuters interview on February 19th. This is when they were asking me about how the government of Japan was responding to the outbreak at the time. So I said, I'd like to believe that public health decisions were driven by science and not influenced by politics, but I'm not naive, having worked in this space for decades. So recently I wrote about a story in the Forbes coronavirus frontlines online about why cases are surging. I looked at certain lessons we could draw from the battlefield. So, you don't always control the timeline in a battlefield, but you can shape the battle space. It's important to gather intelligence to know where the enemy is and deny the enemy will conceal and cover. Well, how do we do that? We do that with testing. So we need to know who's infected to understand how to respond and who needs to be isolated, who needs to be quarantined. And so unfortunately, we've had a challenge with that really since day one, and now we have significant delays with turnaround of tests. It's important to develop a battle plan. Currently, there is no national plan, and even the CDC, which is usually at the forefront of the planning efforts and running the response, has been somewhat undermined along the way. And then we need unity of effort on the battlefield and concentration of force against the enemy. And unfortunately, we don't have that. We essentially have a situation where every state is kind of making it up on their own. But I think ultimately, as much as we want to have an economic rebound, get people back to work, open schools, et cetera, fundamentally, those rely on controlling the viral spread. And it's just somehow we haven't quite figured that out. So looking forward, I think we need to have better imagination and not fight the last war. In the future, there'll be other threats, whether it be the classical threats like the biodefense diseases from a potentially a bioterrorism event, or it might be another COVID type pandemic. We need to reassess our vulnerabilities from natural and man-made outbreaks. We need a sustained investment in public health. We need to shore up the responsiveness of supply chains that have been laid bare in terms of the challenges throughout this. And I think this is the next one here, coordinating scientific innovation. I think we actually have made a lot of strides in this with this outbreak. And it's always a bit of a challenge trying to figure out how to do this. But I think things like the Operation Warp Speed, trying to get a vaccine quickly, I think are good things that have work well. We also need to assess how we communicate public health messages in an era where most people get their news from social media. We need to evaluate what actually worked for this current response and try to apply that for the future. And rather than withdrawing from the international arena, I think we should be out there leading the international response because uh, really infectious diseases know no boundaries. And so if we're not out there leading, we're going to leave the door open for other countries to take the lead, which I don't think is something optimal for us. And it would be good for us to get into China or have a team gets into China to understand the origin of SARS-CoV-2 for future preparations. And with that, I'll just sort of say one of the things I don't have to worry about is job security. So, periodically issues about whether this virus actually came from a bioweapon laboratory in China, they continue to resurface periodically. My own personal opinion is it probably didn't. My own personal opinion is that it most likely was a naturally generated disease that was just, as we saw with previous coronavirus outbreaks, that it was most likely occurring in the natural setting. And then we just had situations develop related to the environment of spread that made the environment conducive to spread. So as I look back on my career a little bit, I've been able to do some cool things. Here I am down at the White House, one of multiple trips I took down there for various reasons. Been able to brief members of Congress here with Congressman Takano from California, briefing him on Ebola during the Ebola crisis. But I've slept on more benches than I care to say over the course of my career, so it hasn't always been fun. But every now and then there's a shining light. Somebody's got to do this tough job. So this is when I was on a NATO panel, and we would meet twice a year in the headquarters in Brussels or at one of the NATO countries. So this was a meeting we had on this biodefense panel in Norway, and they couldn't afford to put us up in a hotel in Oslo. So instead, they put us on a cruise ship, and we cruised for 4 days down the fjords of Norway. And frankly, it wasn't quite as exciting as it sounds because we were really cooped up in a stuffy, warm room, falling asleep for 4 days, talking about NATO standardization agreements. However, we thought, hey, on the last day, let's get a picture to make it look like we had a ball. So here we are, me and some of my NATO colleagues on the last day in the hot tub on the back of the cruise ship. So it's been an interesting career, but in the end, it's all about really working with great people, having a shared mission, shared frustrations, but working together to try to overcome the problems and improve things, ultimately with a focus on the person on the stretcher here, the patient. And if we can keep our focus on the patients as physicians, that's the best we can do, I think, at the end. So as I started at the beginning, I said my career started with an interest to be someone like Hawkeye Pierce. But in the end, as my career has unfolded, I've become more like the Dustin Hoffman character here shown in the movie Outbreak, sort of this virus hunter traveling across the world to stop infectious disease outbreaks. But if you haven't seen this movie, it's a little cheesy here in retrospect, a little bit dated, but it's still kind of a fun thriller. All right, as I close, I'll just say a couple things about the book I mentioned at the beginning. So why would you want to read this book? It's called Inside the Hot Zone, A Soldier on the Front Lines of Biological Warfare. Well, a couple reasons. While you're cooped up inside, still wanting something to do that's fun, it is a page turner. I wrote it specifically as a thriller. So even though it is true to life and it's about my real experiences, I think you'll learn something and you'll find it's a fun read. I also wrote it for all audience, not just science audiences. It's written for anybody who likes to read. So you don't have to be a scientist to enjoy it. In fact, my scientist friends like it, and my friends who are not scientists also have told me they like it. And I think it'll also give you a broader perspective about what's going on in the current environment, what's going on in the current outbreak, and lessons for future outbreaks. So in the end here, if anybody after this lecture has any questions or want to look more up about the book, you could find some more information about my website, markkortepeter.com. Feel free to send me an email at mark.kortepeter@gmail.com. And then, as I mentioned along the way, I write as a contributor to what's called the Coronavirus Frontlines at Forbes.com. And thus far, I've written 13 articles with very practical information about infectious diseases, outbreaks, pandemics, as well as COVID-19. And you can see some of the topics there, things like how to stay safe as America reopens. Can you get infected twice? Is it possible this thing could have released from a lab? Why cases are skyrocketing skyrocketing, et cetera. So you can look to those for some practical advice and information about COVID and infectious diseases. So I think I'll close there, and I guess we don't have time for questions, but as I think we heard early on, feel free to send questions in. I'll be happy to help work with Dyke and the colleagues here about how to answer them. Thank you so much for your attention.
Well, Mark, thanks for joining us. That is a boatload of information, and it's exactly what we were hoping to hear to set up number one, the questions that we could ask to you. And so there is a Q&A button on everyone's interface right now. And so we're going to leave the webinar open even as our panelists leave here. And so if you've got a question that you'd like to ask, if you'd like to go ahead and type that in for Mark, we get a report generated after we close out the webinar of all the questions that are asked, and we can work to make sure that those are answered within the next several days. But also, you will receive an automatic email tomorrow that's generated by our webinar platform. And we do want to thank Mid-Atlantic Christian University for being our webinar sponsor. But we'll get a report, or you'll get an automatic email tomorrow, and we will include the information about Mark's book, where you can purchase that, his email address if you have other questions that you'd like to ask him, but also we'll include links to those Forbes articles that he has written that really are the follow-up applications for those of us that are in church leadership about reopening and kids and masks and things like that. Those articles will really help us understand the implications of the wisdom that you bring to bear against where churches are right now. So we'll have links in the follow-up email tomorrow that you can go to read what Mark has to say about those specific applications for church leaders. So thank you for your time today for our pop-up webinar, all of you who have joined, and we're really glad that you've joined us and heard Mark's tremendous background on leading up to COVID and now leading during COVID. We're glad that he's really joined us. Dyke, thanks for introducing us to Mark today. And we hope that you see us on some of our other, either our pop-up webinars or our upcoming future regular webinars. Our last two have been about how ministry has changed for youth ministries and children's ministries in particular. So if you haven't seen those webinars that have gone out this summer, we invite you to view those or other ones that are part of our YouTube channel. So thanks for your time today. Go ahead and type in your questions now if you've got questions specifically for Mark, and then stay tuned for your email that'll come tomorrow with all the links that you can follow up on. Thanks for your time today. And Mark, thanks again for joining us.
Great. Thank you all. Take care.